Hey guys, I'm back covering round 2 of my World Open tournament. In this round, I was actually paired down again. I was paired against International Master David Gluckman, whose FIDE rating is actually a bit low, but I actually didn't even find out that he was an International Master until after the game. Because when I got the pairing, all they send is the name and the board number. A lot of times they don't even send the rating of the player. So I had no idea until I checked him after the game. Well, in any case, I played d4. He went e6. I usually when players do this, it means they're trying to keep their options open as far as the Dutch goes, which I'm definitely fine with. So I played c4, and yeah, f5 showed up. I decided to play g3, knight f6, bishop g2. In my opinion, this is the most flexible way to reach the main lines of the Dutch, because here white can still develop the knight to f3, which is very typical in most lines. But in case black plays the Stonewall, which is what happens here, white keeps their options open to develop the knight to h3, as I do in this game, which I think is a really interesting choice and a good line against the Stonewall. So d5, knight d2, black played c6, knight h3. And the main point of developing the knight to the side here is that it makes room for the second knight to come to f3, and this knight will one day use the f4 square, in some cases the g5 square, but only if it tactically makes sense. Yeah, I think this is a great way to develop against the Stonewall, because white just gets like a very healthy setup. This knight on f4 often one day lands on d3, and then both knights can kind of challenge for the e5 square. Which is definitely important for white's plan. So black played bishop d6. I think this is pretty normal. Queen c2, castles, castles, bishop d7. I wasn't exactly sure about this move here. It's a very thematic move in the Stonewall to try to bring the bishop to e8 and h5. But against what white is doing, I'm not quite sure if it fully works out for black. So I played knight f3 here. And after some thought, my opponent decided to play a5, so keeping a lot of his options open. I think after bishop e8, white would probably get a clear advantage with the move c5. And now I'm kind of forcing black's bishop to make a decision. If the bishop goes to c7, then after bishop f4, I'm basically forcing the trade of dark squared bishops, and strategically, I think this is really good for white. One knight will come to f4, the other knight will come to e5, and yeah, white is doing really well, I think, in the long run. Or if the bishop drops back to e7, then black is a little bit passive here. White can go like knight f4, for example, already hitting the e6 pawn, covering the h5 square. And yeah, I think black is not really getting what they want from this opening. So yeah, my opponent actually never ended up playing bishop b8 in this game, which makes me believe that maybe bishop d7 is probably not the most accurate way to play the position. I think b6 and developing the bishop somewhere on b7 or a6 is considered pretty typical, and we definitely get a very fighting game, but I certainly have more experience from white's side in this type of position, so I certainly prefer white's chances. In the game after bishop d7, knight f3, a5 was played. I decided to go bishop f4, and black played bishop e7, so retreating, which is actually a pretty thematic idea for black. Now white is kind of fighting for the f4 square with two pieces, and this knight on h3 is kind of awkward, especially if black is able to go h6, then the knight on h3 will quickly get shut out of the game. Okay, so I decided to play knight to e5. I think this is very logical, especially since black doesn't have a knight on d7 that can really challenge me. Black chose knight h5, and I just went back bishop d2. And here my opponent decided to play bishop c8, which definitely, surprised me quite a bit at first, because it seems like he just put the bishop back on c8 and he's lost a lot of time. His idea seems to be that he wants to, of course, develop with knight d7 and challenge the knight on e5, and he would rather keep the bishop on c8 rather than on e8. I guess during the game, yeah, I definitely was expecting bishop e8 because it's just more consistent, but Clearly there was something he didn't like about following up with this idea. Maybe he thought the queen side would be vulnerable with something like queen b3. Or maybe he just didn't see what exactly the prospects are of the bishop, since his knight is on h5, and if he goes knight f6, then white is just going to jump in with knight f4. I'm not exactly sure what happened here, but okay, he chose to play bishop c8. Now I felt like white should have a very clear advantage just because black has lost some time. The knight on h5 doesn't seem good, and meanwhile white's pieces are still placed quite reasonably. But I felt like it would also just not be that easy to convert it from here because, well, the Stonewall is a pretty resilient opening. It can be deceptively solid, I think. For example, like a move like knight f4 I wasn't sure about because this kind of lets black trade off one of his bad pieces. Then after bishop takes f4, knight d7, as more pieces come off, it might be easier and easier to play black's position, and white's space advantage won't really matter as much anymore. So I wanted just to mainly keep a lot of tension and try to keep a big space advantage as much as I could. I also wanted to avoid trades if possible. So I started with this move e3, just kind of a simple move, securing the d4 pawn, controlling the f4 square, knight d7, and knight d3. So not wanting to trade any pieces yet, I figured black's knights are definitely going to be fighting over the same squares, and I should just try to leave those knights on the board and make things somewhat unpleasant for black. He ends up going knight df6, which definitely keeps the knight on h5 somewhat stranded, and after a little bit of thought I decided I should just play f3. It's a pretty typical move here, taking control over the e4 square, not letting black use this one, and setting up the typical Stonewall setup. And this move also allows me to bring my knight back into the game via the f2 square, which I can do if I don't want to play knight f4 and trade some pieces. And the knight on f2 is very useful as it often supports both e4 and g4, which are common breaks in this kind of position. Okay, so he goes knight e8. Now his idea seems to be clearly to play knight to d6, and he wants to bring the other knight back via f6. And I didn't want to make the following move, but eventually I kind of realized that I think it does just kind of fight for the biggest advantage. And after some thought here, I decided I should just shut things down with c5. So this is a really committal move to play because now I'm losing a lot of my pressure against black center. The bishop on g2 in particular, doesn't look like it's doing a whole lot right now. It was and could in the future exert some pressure against the d5 pawn, and once I play c5, I kind of just forfeit all of that pressure, and the bishop, the light squared bishop, is just becomes a very, very restricted piece. On the other hand, I just felt like once I do play c5, then black's knight is not able to use the d6 square, and black's knights have a very hard time reaching good squares here. So for example, if the knight comes to c7, it really just doesn't have any great prospects from there. Knight b5 isn't doing anything. Knight a6, white can play a3, and the knight is similarly just kind of dominated. The f6 square is definitely a good one for black's knights, but only one of their knights can use this square, and that means that the other knight is always just going to be kind of in the way. Another kind of faulty setup is if black puts one knight on f6 and one knight on d7, then white goes knight to f4, and it's very difficult for black to defend the e6 pawn. So this is the problem of not having a lot of space, is that your pieces end up fighting for the same squares, and they end up kind of blocking each other, and these kinds of tactical issues can arise. So yeah, I felt justified to close the center given how much time my opponent has kind of spent, and how misplaced his pieces would be afterwards. He ends up going g6. I think this is a move just to create a g7 square that his pieces can use. I played a3. At this point I felt very comfortable. I knew it would still be a very tough game, but that white should be better in the long run. I decided to keep my options open for playing on both sides of the board. Ideally, I would love to just break somehow with e4 and open up the position. But black is very solid, and especially on the light squares, and I knew it would not be easy. So I wanted to start with a3 just to keep my options open of playing b4 and maybe opening up a second front on the queen side. Okay, so he goes bishop f6. I play king h1, just kind of simple improving move. Bishop g7, And I decided here against transferring the knight to f2, but rather I chose to move knight to g1. My idea here was to bring the knight back to e2, and then maybe even to c3, and then maybe even to a4, and finally to b6, where I think the knight would be really, really well placed. It's a long plan, but it's a very close position, and so white might have time for it. I could also have utilized the f2 square for this, like knight f2, knight d1, knight c3, for example, but over the board somehow I felt knight g1, knight e2 is a cleaner route. Maybe I want to keep my options open of bringing the knight back to f4 if black changes something. I think another interesting idea would have been just to play rook ae1 and just to play for the e4 break, like knight f2 next, maybe bishop c3, e4, and it definitely feels like white will be better there because, again, black has less space. It's very difficult to get the queenside rook into the game. The light square bishop, of course, is a problematic piece. And yeah, I definitely agree with Stockfish here that white would have a pretty nice advantage. But okay, I chose knight g1, knight f6, knight e2. Now on almost every move in the position or in the game, one of the engine suggestions for black is to just break with this move b6. I think during the game, both me and my opponent felt like while this would give black some open lines, it would also create a lot of new weaknesses that white could potentially target. I mean, immediately after taking on b6, white is already creating a c5 square for the knight and an open c file to target the weak c6 pawn. And from the engine's point of view, this is still worth it because at least black can gain some counter activity and maybe can just stubbornly defend with bishop b7 or bishop d7 next. But yeah, from a human point of view, it definitely feels like somewhat of a concession for black to do this. Instead, my opponent was trying just to keep the position as solid as possible, and he played knight to d7. I played bishop c3, just kind of continuing the pace, like slowly improving my position, slowly preparing this e4 break if allowed. At this point, I switched from the idea of playing knight c3, knight a4 because, well, my opponent put the knight on d7, so now knight a4 would not really be coming with any huge threat. So yeah, I thought bishop c3 was okay. Apparently I should have just played e4 right away. There was no reason not to do it with the d4 pawn already sufficiently protected. And looking at it now, yeah, actually makes a lot more sense to play this move with the bishop on d2 because the bishop is, of course, opened up and can use this diagonal, maybe the f4 square in some positions. But yeah, as long as the d4 pawn is already covered, then there's actually no reason not to play e4 immediately. But okay, I wanted to take it a little bit slower. I played bishop c3. Fortunately, this actually induced my opponent to play a4, which I think is certainly a small concession because now the pawn is potentially a weakness, and I can even think about just reverting back to the old plan of putting the knight on c3 and then putting pressure on a4 that way. It also gives up the b4 square, which may be useful in some cases. Instead, actually, I should have played knight ef6, which, according to the engine, gives black a very reasonable position, and now white is hardly better. Again, the idea is to play b6 soon and basically under better circumstances. And yeah, looking at it now, this actually looks like a much healthier position. Now black's pieces are somewhat more coordinated. Seems like the bishop was born to be on g7, and we have some kind of weird Schlechter Slav / Leningrad Dutch hybrid position where I think black might have enough activity with this b6 break to actually be okay here. So yeah, I think I misplayed it a little bit, but based on how the game went, it was certainly hard for black to I think to find the moment because he was also trying to keep things extremely solid. Now I decided to play rook ae1, so I'm setting up the e4 break. Rook f7 was played, knight ef4. Black played knight c7, and finally I saw no reason not to play e4, and again I think white is now clearly better. If black takes on e4, all this does is just open lines for white's pieces. The more lines that open up, I think the more dangerous it is for black because the rook on a8 is just going to be out of the game. Bishop on c8 also just not participating. So instead, black tried to just keep it as solid as possible, not capturing anything, just rook e7. I played queen e2. Adding a little bit of pressure is now if I take on f5, the rook on e7 is going to be hanging. Bishop f8 was played. I decided to go g4. I think this move is totally correct. I'm just adding more pressure on black's position, executing both of my breaks. If black takes either of these pawns, I think it turns out in white's favor just to open more lines. And now the light square bishop is opening up, and I'm more inclined to take on d5 here in the near future, maybe transfer my queen somewhere first, maybe h4, h5. And yeah, it's clear that opening up the position just is favoring white, who has kind of better mobilized pieces here. Instead, my opponent decided to play g5, which is a very committal decision, but I think an understandable one. This invites my knight into h5 and now f4. So his idea was just to try to keep everything blocked up as much as possible. But I think white still has enough ways of opening up the position that it doesn't seem like it's really going to hold for black in the long run. And yeah, it just feels like a very, very shaky defense. So I started with the move h4. I think this is perfectly reasonable, just putting some pressure on g5. Black can never really think about taking this pawn on h4 because white will take the f4 pawn and then the entire king side is opening up. So instead, black is kind of forced to play h6. And I thought this was definitely a small achievement because now the g6 square is actually capable of being used by white's pieces, and I immediately just tried to clamp down on that with queen c2, just kind of x-raying the g6 square. Now black has to worry about maybe white takes on d5 at some point, puts the knight on e5, and then queen comes to g6. Knight on h5 is actually very well placed to kind of support this. So I thought this was a nice way of playing the position. The engine suggests a very subtle move rook to g1, which actually is a similar idea to something we'll see in the game, where the point is basically just to bring the bishop back to f1 and to start transferring white's pieces to the h file of the rook g2, rook h2, or queen h2 first, possibly. And yeah, white just gets a ton of pressure against black's king side here. In any case, I started with queen c2, bishop g7. And here, yeah, I made another very committal move. I think it was still fine. I don't think it really gave up much of an advantage, but probably it wasn't the best way to play the position. I decided to play e5 here, which closes everything up, and it really gives black, I think, a lot more chances of potentially setting up a fortress, because now the position is blocked up, and it's not such a big deal that black's rooks are disconnected. Objectively, you know, I really should have just kind of gone with my first instinct, which was to take on d5, kind of keeping the position open. Here, after e takes d5, rook e7, let's say rook e1, queen f7. I wasn't totally sure about a position like this, what exactly the evaluation would be, because, well, I mean, material is still equal. You know, I haven't yet activated my light square bishop. You know, that's kind of been one casualty of this recent change in the structures, that the light square bishop is just a really passive piece on g2. If the bishop can get to d3, then it's going to be a much stronger piece, but that definitely takes time. And I thought white would be better here. I just wasn't sure how big the advantage would be. Stockfish thinks after just trading on g7 and pushing h5, then the plan knight e5, bishop f1, bishop d3, and white just has kind of a colossal advantage here, you know, north of +2. I think that definitely makes sense. During the game, you're never quite sure how big the advantage is, so yeah, what can I say? I just wasn't 100% confident in this. Even rook f2, I think, maybe would have been the best move, just the most flexible, keeping all my options open, setting up this plan of like bishop f1, and then maybe I can double on the e file or start setting up some kind of invasion on the h file. I think this would have been better than my choice as well. Ultimately, I decided to play e5 mainly because I wanted to prevent any kind of counter ideas from black. I wasn't too concerned about black playing a move like e5, but it was definitely in the back of my head that you know, it's not like white just has a free hand to do whatever I want here. The opponent does have ambitious ideas of his own, and at some point he might just break in the center. And if I'm not prepared for it, then it could end up costing me. So this move was just, I think, kind of just to secure at least some advantage, keeping control over the position. I don't think it was totally necessary, but I also felt like I should have enough resources to still break through to the position. My main plan being to transfer the knight to h3, putting more pressure on the g5 pawn, putting the rook on f2 after that, bishop f1, bishop d3, maybe the rook swings to h2, And I felt like if I can get all of this in, then I'll have a lot of pressure against the king side. And if none of that works out, well, I always have the backup plan, honestly, of just playing queen d1, bishop c2, and just trying to pick up the a4 pawn. You know, if nothing works on the king side, then yeah, I can still go after this pawn, and it won't be easy for black to first defend the king side and then also keep control over the queen side. Okay, so he goes knight f8. I think this was definitely the only reasonable move in the position, just kind of putting the knight on a good defensive square, preparing bishop d7. I start maneuvering. And this is really the drawback to the move e5, is that because I've closed the position, now black has more time to put his pieces on better squares and try to set up some kind of a defense. But ultimately, I felt like white just has too much of a space advantage here that it really, you know, I should be able to break through. Okay, so here the engine actually prefers to move bishop to e8, but this is kind of connected with sacrificing the pawn on g5. And from a Hewen point of view, it might not be necessary just yet to sacrifice the pawn, so he decided just to try to keep everything solid with rook f7. Now the queen is defending the g5 pawn. But okay, I just keep improving my position like I was planning. Rook f2, bishop e8, bishop f1, rook d7 was played, bishop d3. I really wasn't too concerned about the capture bishop takes h5 and g takes h5 because I felt like this is just going to open up the king side, and now all of a sudden white has a beautiful open g file to use for the rooks. I definitely don't care about black taking on h4 here. I think white's attack would just be just totally overwhelming, and yeah, knight coming to f4 and so on. So I definitely would not be unhappy to see bishop takes h5. Instead, black decided to play knight b5. I wasn't sure exactly whether he wants to take on c3 or not, because I just felt like that's only going to help white. I mean, this bishop on c3, for being honest, is not a great piece, at least not at the moment. I definitely had long-term ideas, if I wasn't able to break through, of just trying to sacrifice a knight on f4 for 2 pawns, activating the dark squared bishop, and then getting queen d2, rook g2, and just pushing the g-pawn forward. I think these kinds of sacrifices are always having a lot of potential, but it's something that you should keep in the back of your mind and not really focus on for the time being. Instead, I decided, okay, I just want to play rook h2 here, just improving the rook. Now he ends up taking on c3, b takes c3, and b6. So yeah, very logical. I mean, he gets b6 in finally, and if white is not careful, I mean, black could all of a sudden just create some real counterplay on the queen side, queen b6, queen b3, and so on. So I realized I have to be very precise here. I felt like, okay, I have no choice but to take on b6. For the moment, queen takes b6 would be hanging the g5 pawn, so this doesn't seem very good for black. But instead he can play rook b7, as happens in the game, and just try to regain the pawn with the rook. I played rook b1 here, just trying to slow him down for one more move. Now rook takes b6, I'm taking on b6 and taking on g5. So he goes rook a b8. And this was now, I felt like a really critical moment, because the character of the game has kind of changed all of a sudden. I'm no longer making any threats on the king side, and black is the one with all the play in the position on the queen side. And I realized, you know, I don't have a great way to stop him of just regaining the pawn on b6. Rook takes b6 is next, followed by taking with the second rook. I could take the pawn on a4 here and keep a small material advantage, but I wasn't exactly sure what's happening here after c5. And then rook takes b6 to follow, or maybe rook takes b6 first, followed by maybe c5 one day. And I'm up a pawn, but I have not exactly set my pieces up here to win by means of an extra pawn. Like, if I have an extra a pawn here, that's good, but my pieces are very far from being able to support this pawn, whereas black's pieces seem very comfortable to play on the queen side. So I haven't exactly set up my pieces in the right way if this is going to be my intention. So I really was just looking for something to do on the king side here, something more aggressive. I should mention that this was actually move 40, and my opponent was in time trouble for a little while here. And now we both have one move to make until the time control. I think At this point, I had a good chunk of time, maybe 10-15 minutes, and he had about, I think, a minute, maybe 30 seconds or something to make his final move, which isn't a lot of time. I think we're only playing with like 10-second delay or something in the tournament, but it's definitely enough time to make one move, and it's a good chunk of time to even make a reasonable move. Also, given that his last few moves have been all about recapturing the b6 pawn, I figured it's not going to be very hard for him to just play rook takes b6 against, basically anything white does. Okay, if I play h takes g5 here, he'll probably just calmly recapture, as, I could have taken on g5 at any moment, and it's not leading to anything immediately concrete, so I don't think black has anything to fear here. Similarly, if I take on g7, he probably just takes back with the king, as he was kind of planning for the last several moves. So yeah, I just started looking for opportunities here. Eventually, I was able to find something really interesting, and it ends up working out really nicely for white, so that was kind of cool. But I ended up starting with this move, queen to d2. And in fact, at this point, I'd already kind of calculated basically until the end of the game, mainly because the line was very straightforward and kind of a straight shot to calculate. Okay, so black here ends up playing a rook takes b6. I mean, kind of as expected, he has like 30 seconds to make a move. I played a seemingly like quiet move, queen d2, not really threatening a whole lot, so what should he do other than just take on b6? This ends up being probably the losing mistake. Apparently queen e7 here would still give black at least a reasonable position. I think white is still better here, but the game would certainly continue for quite some time. But I have to say, queen e7 is a very hard move to find. I mean, the engine only sees it because it understands that rook takes b6 is losing for black, so of course it finds the only defense, but for a human point of view, it's a very difficult move to play. Okay, so I'll show you guys what happened. Rook takes b6, I traded on b6, rook takes b6, and now my point was I realized I have concrete action available to me on the king side, so finally I decided to start breaking through. Knight takes g7, king takes g7, hg, hg, and now would be a good time to pause if you haven't yet figured out what white's idea is going to be, and try to find the best move for white and try to calculate it as best you can. Okay, and so the point of my last several moves, the point of playing queen d2 from afar, was to reach this position and to have the following sacrifice, knight takes f4, available, which I realized was actually just going to leave black in an extremely dangerous position. Black doesn't really have such a great choice here. I mean, if he doesn't take back the piece, then white is just completely winning. Knight h5 check is coming, I've snagged a pawn, and so things are very, very good for white. So g takes f4, queen takes f4, and now the point of the piece sacrifice is that white just has three very strong pieces into the attack. Black's king on g7 is left without sufficient defense, and white has a lot of ideas here, a lot of checks such as queen h6 check coming and so on. And basically the king is not getting out and is kind of caught in a mating net. So black had some options here to defend. In the game, he ended up playing rook to b8. I think the idea behind this move was to keep the queen defended so that the king could try to run out this way if white got too quick with the checks, but ultimately loses to kind of a nice resource. If you want to pause the video, I think this is another good training exercise, white to play and win. Try to find the most convincing move here for white. Okay, and I actually ended up seeing this move from afar, which was kind of nice. Rook h8. It's a very nice series of ideas here, basically just leading to mate. If king takes h8, then queen takes f8 as mate. Actually, this is how the game ended. My opponent realized he didn't have any other defense, so he decided just to graciously allow checkmate on the board, and that was cool. After this move, rook h8, the problem is, of course, that black's knight on f8 is hanging. If black defends the knight with queen to e7, then white gives mate with queen h6 check, king f7, and bishop g6. This is kind of a very key resource. Without this move, things would be, I think, a lot more complicated, but this just makes it simple. Knight takes g6, queen h7 is mate. And so this mate shows up in a lot of different variations, especially when black goes queen to e7, kind of blocking off the king's escape. But also, even without the queen on e7, the same mate would be working. So this is just one of white's main ideas in the position. So after rook b8, rook h8, this was basically over. Had black tried some other moves here, nothing is really working. For example, like bishop g6 in this position, loses to queen h6, bishop takes g6 with check, knight takes g6, queen h7, and white recaptures the knight on g6. We've gained our material back, and of course white's attack is still just totally devastating. The nice thing about this entire line is that in all the variations, the bishop for the most part has been on d3 and covering the b1 square, meaning black has no counterplay with rook b1 check. And even in this line, after taking on g6 with check and queen h7, everything with check, queen takes g6, the queen ends up covering the b1 square, and black just has no defensive counter chances here. So yeah, going back to this position, there is not a whole lot black can try. Maybe queen e7 was another attempt. Here I think white wins with queen h6 check. If king f7, then I think just g5, and the pawn is coming to g6, and black has no counterplay and just getting mated. If the king goes to g8, this is a little bit trickier because here black at least has an idea of playing queen g7 and actually rebuffing the attack, so g5 is not really working here. But instead white can play queen h8 check, forcing the king to f7, and now a strong move rook h6, which threatens rook f6 check, and yeah, basically black is again not surviving. It's also threatening, by the way, the same motive, bishop g6 check, knight takes g6, and rook h7 mate, which is another cool idea. So yeah, basically after queen takes f4, there is no defense, and that was the end of the game. So like I mentioned, the game ended rook b8, rook h8, black took, and we got mate on the board. So overall, I was pretty happy with this game. Obviously, I realized that it certainly wasn't perfect from a strategic point of view. In the end, you know, I think the timing just kind of worked out nicely for white. Had I played this move, queen d2, in a position maybe after the time control when my opponent would have had like 30 minutes to think, it's pretty likely he wouldn't have just taken on b6 and would have maybe considered the potential sacrifice. I mean, that's kind of like white's only big idea in the position, and it's more likely he would have found a key defense. So the timing there really kind of worked out for me, that I was able to pose such a difficult question in a situation where my opponent only had like 30 seconds to make a decision. And yeah, most reasonable players, they're just going to take the pawn on b6. You know, not a whole lot we can do otherwise. Yeah, I definitely feel like I could have played more accurately in the middle of the game and gotten a bigger advantage. But at least I was happy with the calculation at the end. I thought it was a well-played attack, and I was happy that, you know, I checked everything afterwards and all the lines were correct, so I didn't make any huge mistakes in the calculation there. So that was pretty cool. All right, in the next round, I would be paired against the Grandmaster. That was an interesting game, and I'll see you guys then. Take care.